The topic for today's video, beefing sounds up. If you haven't already, I would recommend watching the video on thinning sounds out because these techniques really go hand in hand. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but on any given production, there'll be times where you need to thin sounds out and times where you need to beef sounds up, or in some cases, you'll use those same techniques on the same sound source. So thinning it out in order to beef it up, thinning it out in order to make it mix, beefing it up in order to make it glue. You know, that's kind of the way that I look at this whole process. And you might think, well, we can just leave all of this stuff for the mix. So I'm just going to find all the cool sounds. And then at the very end, I'll make them all work together. And sometimes that will work for you, but sometimes it won't because you'll find that you're constantly chasing your tail. So I at least personally like to try to get all my stuff gelling together in the production stage and then just use the mix for like massaging a little bit, but to each their own. Also want to just point out that the plugins that you're going to see used here are not things that you necessarily need. You can use anything. You can use your stock plugins. You can use other stuff. For example, in this video, I don't think we even use Soundtoys Decapitator once, which is rare for me because I tend to use that all the time to do the beefing up of sounds. But for whatever reason, I didn't feel the need to go to it this time. So just because I didn't use it doesn't mean you shouldn't. And just because I did use something else doesn't mean you should use that. So I like to stress that every time because there's no essentials. There's no must-have plugins. There's just different tools to try to get you to the end result. So this is going to be a slightly longer video. We're going to go absolutely crazy in this one. We're going to way overdo it. This is what people are going to look at and go, so this is the death of like modern music, but that's okay. It's a chance for us to look at these techniques and, you know, have a little bit of fun in the process. So let's get into it. Here's the loop that you are going to be sick of in the next 15 to 20 minutes. So there's nothing wrong with that, but it does sound very plastic. I'm sure many of you can guess or already know where these sounds were sourced from, but these sounds do give us a lot of opportunities and a lot of potential to bulk them up or beef them up in various ways. And that beef it up is just a lingo. So, you know, static EQ, dynamic EQ, saturation, compression, limiting, you know, all of those various tools and processors in combination are ways that you can beef up the signal. And we're going to look at tons of examples here. So the first thing I thought I would show you, which I wasn't planning to, but I thought about, I was like, all right, let's show you, is to do the classic, you know, channel strip followed by bus processing. Because this is so sparse, the difference it's going to make is actually going to be pretty subtle. But let's go ahead and we'll bring those on. We'll bring on the channel strip and bus processing. So here's what the bus looks like. And here's an example of what this channel strip looks like. Now, all of these are different. I like this one because I find that it has a pretty flattering effect on most styles of music without doing too much. Now, one thing to watch out for is the compressor is on by default. And so you really got to watch that and do your gain staging. I was okay with about 1 to 2 dB of compression on all the various channels. And that's actually what's going to be making the biggest difference on the final sound of this when we add in the other processors. But these things are supposed to add a little bit of analog warmth and grit as if it's going through an actual console. So we'll turn this on and off and we'll see if you can hear the difference. Let me make sure I start with it off. Okay, we'll pop it on here. So you can see the compressor working and it's doing that on all the channels. I didn't really change the settings too much. And back on. So especially in the low end, you hear kind of a rounding out of the tone, but the overall effect that this is having is probably more of a gluing than a really noticeable beefing up. And that's okay because sometimes that is what you're going for, especially if you have, you know, something with way more tracks than this and multiple buses. This overall effect can be massive. This is a little more subtle, but I would say it's flattering. Like I would stick with this if I was trying to go for something a bit more subtle. And again, I just want you guys to look at, you know, how much compression is being applied to some of these different channels. Okay, so on and off one final time. Cool. And then I just decided, let's go ahead and take this all the way out, because what we actually did in that case was probably bring the volume, well, it sounded almost totally even, but I know that with that compression, we probably have a little more room to play with. So I hear that low end being brought up, and at that point, I actually brought this in ahead of the bus, which is the TDR Nova GE, and we can see what this is doing. I'm just bringing the lows out a little bit and increasing the highs. So classic sort of pop music technique here. So you really just hear the clarity being brought up. And then for a little bit more beef, but nothing too extreme, still I'm hoping for some subtlety, we're going into our Satin tape machine using a preset that's just been very, very finely tuned, as in I only just touched the input and the output, I didn't do anything else to it. So let's listen to this one. So the funny thing is that is almost, and I'm not sure why I maybe made this decision, but this is almost offsetting what we did with the Nova. It is again now kind of making it rounder and a little bit warmer. And that was probably my thought process behind it, was going for that warmth. Because we see this going into the red a little bit, that's telling me that it's smoothing out some of those transients. So now we are actually like losing gain. And the final stage is then just going to be going into the peak limiter and just barely kissing it the same way we had on that starting plastic finish. So we'll just turn that on, and that's literally just to try to give us a more fair level comparison. Okay, so let's turn off this additional processing and then back on. And I'll do one where everything goes out and off. So everything off. Okay, so now the final thing we have to do is a comparison between these two, and we'll talk a little bit about that before we really get into this tutorial proper. Okay, so here's what we started with. And there's where we finished. So I would say, like, in the lower end of the frequency spectrum, we've taken off a little bit of that plastic sheen, but on the whole, it still is pretty generic sounding. Like, it's not very bulky or beefy. Nothing wrong with that, but that gives you an idea, especially if you do have stuff that is a little bit bulkier to begin with, if you're trying to take it to that next level or glue it together. What I just showed you there as a quick down and dirty little chain, bus processing chain, will definitely work. So let's keep moving and let's start to do some crazy stuff with each of these individual parts. Drums are actually pretty easy to soup up and beef up and still sound somewhat decent. Here's what our drums sound like with no processing. And that sound might actually work just fine in a lot of different mixes, depending on the other things that are going on. But you can clearly kind of hear the kick drum coming through fine, and you hear that snare. There's not a lot going on in the high end, but that's clearly saving room for other stuff. All that being said, here's what it sounds like with our processing turned on that we just looked at a couple seconds ago. And that's a very flattering sound and would definitely work. But again, we're not totally reshaping it. We're not going to the extreme, but that's what we're going to do here. Here in this project, the first thing that we have is the MaxxVolume. So let's hear what it's doing. So notice that we're not working with the high level at all. We're going to use the L2 to do that, but we're working with that low level. So everything that's below this threshold, RMS level wise, somehow this plugin is able to bring it up. And it's more of a transparent thing. So you're not really adding additional harmonics or overtones, but it really is filling in the gaps on a dynamics level. Don't know how that particular plugin does what it does, but it works great in this particular context. So now we can start to look at coloring and pushing things further. So with the L2, we are now going to push down hard on the peaks. So you can see we have our modern setup. I think we started with EDM punchy and then we maybe made a couple of tweaks. So let's take a listen to this. You can see at the output, I have brought this all the way down to -6. And with these two things off, and then back on. Okay, so just like that, that would actually be a pretty good drum sound. We've obviously done no static EQ to this, and that is something that we would look into. But those are two quick and easy ways, just with dynamics processing, to kind of squish the signal, bring up the level of impact on it, and would lead you to be able to set kind of a lower setting here and mix everything else in. But we're going to push things further. We're going to go to the OTT next, which is the over-the-top compression, and you can see the way that I've set this up. Depth has only been set to 27%, so it's going to sound crazy when I bring this up to 100. Now I could try to balance it from 100%, but you can see I've boosted like the overall output or signal level of the highs. And anytime you're doing anything multi-band, whether it's compression, saturation, whatever, the important thing is how you then set those balances at the end. So that's just as important as any of the other effects processing you've done. So you can see here with this part of the signal, with this 27% of the effect, I'm trying to bring up the high end just a little bit. And that's really what we're listening for. That's the real obvious part, but it also is adding even more weight in the low end. Okay, so pretty straightforward. And now if we really want to beef them up, one of the plugins, it's an oldie, but it's a goodie. We have Vintage Warmer, where we have ability to control low and high. We can set those frequencies. We drive in, we set the knee. All these things you can mess around with to kind of get this sound that you're about to hear. It's going to be a massive change. It's going to get loud too. Maybe I should turn these on together. So obviously that's pretty extreme. So now we do have to sculpt things out a little bit with the Pro Q. And what we're gonna do is a kind of a classic pop or modern dance music sort of thing, where we're gonna really just carve out these low mids and then boost some of these areas that are gonna give us more clarity in the hit on the snare. And then I think just in general, a nice little boost to the highs that are around 4.5K. So let's listen when we turn these on and off. So you can see how crucial this one is here at 1K. Gives a lot more bite through. And that right there is just for control. And this is kind of a mixing thing because we know we have a couple other bass sounds coming in. And that's to clear up the sub range and give it a little more hit right around where those subwoofers usually like to react really strong. So that is what we have done on the drums. So with all of these things off and on, this is what it sounds like. Obviously, there's a big gain mismatch too. On now to our bass pluck. Here's what it sounds like raw. And then with that processing, that's the very basic standard stuff. Very small difference, basically just sounds like it's getting louder. And now here we are with our new little chain. So one thing that we have to do, and one thing that is going to help us avoid the plasticness, is to add some spatial effects. So in this case, we do have a delay that has been put on. I believe in another one, we have a bit of a reverb that we add just to try to fill up some space. So reverb, delay, that can also be used for beefing things up because it is adding density. And that's what we start out with here with this delay plugin. Again, this is a very standard delay plugin that's just quick and easy to work with. So that's what we've used in this case. So let's take a listen. And you're not even really going to hear the delay until we keep moving forward. So without it, okay, so you can barely hear it. You can see it's doing a tiny, tiny bit, but it's going to get a lot louder as we go on. Up next, we have a leveling amplifier from Analog Obsession. I just tried a few different things that I thought might work well, and this one worked okay. So, and listen to how the delay has been brought up. Okay, no delay. And then from there, we're going into the tuba to try to smooth it out, which sounds weird that we're going in like one very mu limiting amplifier into another sort of tube amplifier. But again, this is just kind of the fun part of this whole process, is that you don't need to follow or abide by any rules in terms of a standard signal processing chain. If you can get that final tone at the end, that's what's important. Let's turn all three of these off and on. And we're trying not to listen so much to the gain that's being added on, but just the weight. And that's a hard thing to describe or to put into technical terms, because I know gain is being added on as well. The next thing we have is really more just to show you guys this particular plugin. In this particular instance, because of how digital and plastic the sound is to begin with, I don't think this is super flattering, but this is a popular plugin that can be used where you have a multi-band exciter and you can try different modes and determine how much you bring in. So this is the Ozone 9 exciter. And we're really putting more pressure here on these low mids and in the high end to try to bring that area up. But to me, this isn't super flattering until we then go into the limiter. So. So to me, that has kind of a digital plastic kind of sound to it. This thing can work great on certain source material. It doesn't work great here. I just wanted to show it off as a multi-band exciter. Something like Satin from FabFilter is also great. You can kind of do the same thing where you separate out the bands. But we'll talk more about multi-band stuff in a little bit. So next up, we have the limiter. And you're actually going to hear now with the limiter, it kind of tones this thing back and gives it more of an analog sound. So I like what it does after that exciter and reining back into tone. Then we go into one of my favorite enhancers, which is not that different to the Ozone 9 exciter. It has a couple different modes, but this one is the more dark mode. The other one is the more kind of bright, sheeny kind of thing. So with this particular sound, after we added on that Ozone 9 exciter, using this LUXE mode, I think made more sense. So it does a great job of filling in that space. And then last but not least, we're going into, again, our tape. And this time we are driving it very hard, as you can see. Here's what it looks like going in. And we're using this particular preset, the sweet spot, which I absolutely love. I use this on a lot of different material. It almost always just sounds good and flattering. Okay, so now if we take all these things in and out, we can hear the difference. But really listen to how that delay is working. You don't even really realize it's there, but it's helping to fill in a lot of space. And then with the drums. Next, we have these little lead blips. And again, we'll go back into our previous project and take a listen. These are tricky because of how bright and sort of just high-endy this information is to begin with. It's tough to add on a lot of stuff that's not going to make it sound too harsh. So that was the real challenge with this sound. It already has a bit of an obnoxious quality, so how do we enhance it without it being super, super obnoxious in those frequencies that just cut through and make you want to roll around on the floor, and not for the right reasons? So there's an example where I would actually argue that processing that we've brought on is having the inverse effect where it's like just piercing. And that is not something we want. So let's see what we do here in this project with it. Here we have a very long chain. And the one thing that you notice about this sound is just how dry it is. So what I decided to do was to fill up space, but without adding a tail, is to just use like the early reflections and maybe a touch of reverb. So yeah, there's a little bit of reverb, but mostly we're focused in on these early reflections. So it really adds a dimension before we then start to add some more weight to it. Now, I think I've talked about interstage before. There's nothing that you can actually control or adjust. It's just a way of, again, trying to add density and give it a little bit more of like an analog feel. And it works well on material like this that can be so piercing. I noticed that it just kind of tones that back a little bit. So that's why we have a couple different instances of interstage in, and we might turn everything in and just turn those two on and off, and maybe you'll be able to hear a bit of a difference. So we're going into OTT next. You can see the settings that we have and what it's doing specifically to those early reflections. It's bringing those out. So it's bringing up a really, really high end without focusing on those fundamental main frequencies. If we were to emphasize those too much, we would be getting that kind of roll on the floor piercing sound, which I'm not getting. And then we go into LUXE. And this time we are using the brighter mode. So you can hear how that opens up the sound. Another instance of interstage to try to warm it up slightly. And then we go into a couple of Air Windows plugins, Purest Drive, Purest Squish, and then into the Pro L. And we're working pretty hard in that Pure L. Let you guys see what we got going on mode-wise here. Okay, so let's turn these guys all on and off and just hear the difference. And it's the idea of adding in those fairly smooth, not super duper smooth, but somewhat smooth early reflections, and then kind of enhancing those the rest of the way through, kind of trying to blend that in with the original without letting that original signal get too obnoxious and too ear-piercy. Now let's try turning the interstage on and off and just see if that makes a noticeable difference to you. And specifically listen for how those early reflections feel like they get glued back to the signal. To me, it does a really good job. It's not something that's overly noticeable, but it does make a difference, you know, especially adding in a couple here. If we just had one, we probably really wouldn't be able to hear much of a difference. Okay, so let's bring back in the drums and our little bass pluck. I know we're clipping, don't worry about it. All right, cool. And then we just have one more part to work with, and that is our bass sustain. And this one's gonna be processed a little more traditionally. So again, it's actually not gonna probably sound too different to what we have in this one, but let's go ahead and back and listen. Here is the bass sustain part without any processing on. And then with. And the trick here, and actually I think the processing that we've done has done a good job with this, is controlling this peak and making sure that it stays attached to everything else. So that is also what I think we put a lot of pressure on in this particular signal processing chain as we will go through it. First thing that we've put on is just more of a mixing safety thing. So we've created a mono maker. So all the frequencies under 87 Hertz or so have been moved into mono if they weren't already, because you can tell this is a stereo signal. There's some kind of chorus on this. Then the next thing I put my attention to was that peak. So that's why we're using track limit here. Smooth setting, slow release time. And then with it off, really just listen to that main peak. All right, so it brings everything closer together, glues it a little bit. Same reason for using this Brit pre. This is just purely a color thing. Okay, very little difference. And then the one that's going to make a big difference is the black box analog design. And you can see all the things I have turned on and how hard I've been driving it. So let's take a listen. So that's the real critical one. An instance of interstage just to smooth things. And then you had another bass enhancer here from Analog Obsession. Ooh, listen to what that does to that low end. And then to recover some of the higher frequencies, an instance of LUXE. So what we started with, and then what we finished with. And then we can listen to all of these guys mixed back together down here. So this was our plastic finish without any of this processing. And then we're going to have the one with all the processing. The peaks have actually been matched, but obviously the one that we've just beefed up is going to sound ridiculously louder. Now, there's still a lot of work to do because this is not really mixed properly, but these are just some basic processing chains you can use to beef up your signals in different kinds of ways with different kinds of strategies. So let's go ahead now and take a listen to these. And the fair criticism to levy is, well, like that beefed up one really doesn't sound particularly good. It sounds like it's been way, way overprocessed. And I would agree with you on that front, but that is okay because we are going to be able to do some mixing and do some other things a little bit later on here to see if we can then bring it back and give it a nice sound overall. Now that everything has been beefed up to the max, we're going to look at finessing it a little bit. So when we finished with the drums before, there was basically no dynamics whatsoever. So what we've done here is we've added an instance of the glue, and this is actually going to be working in parallel, I believe. Yeah, so we actually have it about 50-50 on the dry wet. And you're going to see the settings that I have is a really slow attack, really fast release. We have it on like a limiting setting, and we're going to try to let this kind of bring back some punch. So let's take a listen to that. So specifically when you hear the hits of like those snares, so it is tough to bring back a ton, but we've brought back a little bit. This peak limiter is just here for safety, and then we have an EQ that we're going into. To get us a little bit more of a pretty and defined tone. And that is what the settings look like on the EQ. Okay, next we have the bass. And with the bass here, all we have done, I believe, is added on another EQ. So let's take a listen to that. So we're actually losing some punch out of this one and adding a lot more high end to make sure that that fits in with those drums. Just a tiny bit better, very subtle. Then we have our little lead blips here, and you can see with the lead blips, we've added on here an EQ plus, which is getting rid of all of that low end information. And then I believe it is also reacting to the drums. Apologies, we're going into crazy spike mode, but this is relating to the drums, and then it is pulling out at that 4.4 or 4.5K region to make more room for the high end in the drums and to maybe reduce a little bit of the annoying tone. So let's take a listen to that with the drums. Also an EQ has been brought on. So listen for all the room that we're going to create. And we're starting to get a little bit closer to something cohesive here and not having too many parts stepping on each other's toes. Then we look at our bass sustain, and we have a similar thing that has been added on here, this time with, I believe, the low end, and I'm not sure what's going on at that 1K region. Let's take a listen. Okay, we're actually bringing up a little bit there because this area is lacking information. So just to, again, fill in some gaps. And another EQ instance. And that one's definitely for enhancement. Yep, there's no cuts at all in that one. And even a little bit of saturation's been added on. So let's turn these on and off. So listen to how that sustained bass just falls into place, especially in the low end. Okay, then with everything together, and the other thing we've done by doing this is that we've actually given ourselves more room to work with when we do our final processing, our final beef up on the mix bus. So you can see how much more dense, you can just by looking at them, the density on this beefed 1 versus beefed 2. So let's listen to these differences here. The first thing you're going to hear is where we were at previously, followed by the stuff we've just added on and changed to try to kind of fit these parts together just a bit better. So with that second one there's actually room for us to now add stuff back in to kind of fill it out a little bit more. Whereas with this one, there's no room to do much of anything, as you can hear. And in our final stage here, we are going to be kind of like doing bus processing to where we just left off previously. So you can see the chain already. There's nothing special or unique about this. It's just about trying to find the stuff that's going to enhance the sound and not hurt it. So we start with a little bit of an EQ. And that EQ is pulling down on the really low-endy stuff just to kind of try to even this all out for us. Then we're just turning the volume down a little bit for gain staging reasons. Then we are going into our multiband compressor, and we're starting with a preset that I almost always use and then just tweak. And as I mentioned previously, the thing with anything multiband, check how your final gain is in each of these sections. That's more important or as important as the processing that you're doing. So let's take a look, turn this on. Very light. but the important part are the gain stages at the end. So like the preset says, it makes things a little bit more crisp. As you can see, it tries to add a decent amount of gain there on the highs. This is followed up by going into Satin. So it's funny, we've kind of added clarity and boosted up those high highs only to pull those back away with Satin. So let's listen to what happens when we bring this back in. I believe we're using the sweet spot preset again and then just gain staging it. Yep, listen to that low end. And we are not even having it hit any of the peaks. And I believe my thought process there, and normally you're gonna tickle the red, is that we've already done so much of that and we're gonna go into a final limiter that I don't wanna touch the peaks anymore. This is really mainly just for color and a little bit of weight. So far, it really sounds like we're almost losing something, right? But we are going to bring it back in. That's the idea. Sometimes you're taking away to add in later on. So next we have a LUXE. Purely just set to taste. And then because we've added so much low end with these last two processors, I pretty much just repeated what I did previously with the fab filter. And then last but not least, we see how hard we can crank this into the L2 to give us our final sound. And we have cranked it pretty severely. I have no idea if YouTube is going to drastically change our dynamics there. If it does, so be it. But we can now listen to our final end result from where we were previously, or we can listen to all of these really. Okay, so here's where we started. After our first round of heavy processing. Then doing some mixing. And then some final enhancements. And to be honest, the real comparison we should be listening to would be these ones, because loudness wise, these are the closer ones. Okay, so. Obviously, this has been taken to the absolute extreme, and we've pushed things way harder than they probably should be pushed. But for the sake of example, I think that's totally okay. You've seen a lot of different ways to beef up your sound. It's not just using saturation. It's doing static EQ, dynamic EQ, exciters in some cases, multiband compression, whatever the case may be. And then also even using mixed techniques to pull stuff out in order to then give us kind of a louder, more powerful final sound at the end of the day. So hopefully this has been of some use to you. Again, the plugins don't matter. You can use whatever and you can achieve very similar results. So thanks for watching. And until next time, I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.